Good morning and welcome to the Mormon News Report podcast, Sunday School edition for Monday, May 2nd. I am your host, Ben Bernards, filling in for our regular Jenny Noonan Dye. It is not the same without her today. We miss her shining, smiling face. And today I'm always joined, as always, with our executive producer, Mr. John Dye, who's handling all the wonderful magic behind the scenes, making sure that everything looks great and sharp on camera with all of our graphics. Also, a reminder for our regularly weekly podcast listeners, if you want to join us for all the discussion of the news happenings in the world of Mormonism and her followers, you can find us, as always, on the Mormon News Report podcast on Facebook or wherever you get your podcasts. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We are so glad to have you here in Sunday School. We are so thrilled to have you here. And if you are a longtime listener or you've been here before, we are glad to have you back. We hope that this has been uplifting and fulfilling for you as you try to find some light and truth on your Sabbath day or during the week. We are thankful to have you here for this Come Follow Me lesson. This is our hour of power, as we call it. We learn about and discuss church history at a slightly different level than what you've done before. And as always, please comment in the stream where you are joining us from. We love to see people from all across the country and all around the world. We've got a little bit of an international reach here sometimes, and we're happy to see that we've got good representation in other places. We hope that this is useful for you. And please feel free, as always, to comment during the class. We try to get to as many of your discussions as we can. And we want to make sure that people feel like their voices are heard here. We want this to be a safe, welcoming place for everybody. So our discussion today and the lesson for Sunday School today is all about Come Follow Me for the week of May 2nd, which covers just one single section, Doctrine and Covenants, section 45. It is a long section. There is a lot of stuff there, but it breaks down into several different major themes. And so for the goal for today's class, we want to look at two or three of those different themes and see, what we can learn from it and kind of explore it in a slightly different way than we have before. And I'd like to lead off with a introductory question. As you know, you've seen that I've done before when we've had Jenny on board. And this one, actually, we're going to throw it behind the camera. We're going to ask John. You may not be able to see him, but hopefully you'll be able to hear his voice. And if you are out there and if you have actually had this happen to you before, we'd love to hear your experiences. So question for today, have you ever needed a defender against an accuser, either formally or informally? John, what do you think?
Wow, great question. Yeah, there have been times in my life when I have needed a defender against an accuser. My mind first goes to a court of law, right? You have to have somebody represent you, or, well, I guess you don't have to, but it's often very good to have somebody defend you. Someone who knows the legal system, can make their way through it, can properly advise you on the things that are happening. And I'd like to be able to say I've never had to have that, but that has been something in my life where I've needed to rely on the counsel of others to help me win my way through certain situations legally. Also, I think, as kids too, right? There have been, moms, and I think dads, parents, are often our most ardent advocates, right? They're our defenders. It gets to the point sometimes, I even think, when, there was a situation here in Orem recently where there was a soccer match and two dads started going at it, and there was there was a fervor about one of the dads going back to his truck to get a handgun. And anyway, I think it can be carried to extremes, but I think we all need defenders, right, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the kind of thing where you want somebody that's got your back, somebody that's going to be there to represent you, somebody that can totally vouch for you. I've been in, you were talking about legal situations. I had a story in my life the first time that I really needed it. I'd gotten in a car crash and it wasn't my fault. This was in the middle of the winter time. I was driving over Point of the Mountain to head to a job up in Salt Lake City. I was living down in Provo. So if you're not from the Utah area, Point of the Mountain is this weird spot on the freeway that goes it's running from north to south. And where the freeway goes up, normally it's pretty flat, but there's the tail end of this mountain that comes through. And instead of like, you don't want to go through it, and you can't go all the way around it, because all of a sudden there was this huge ravine down the other side. So the road has to kind of go up and curve around the foothills, and it makes this really sharp turn. But it was for years the primary bottleneck of traffic between Salt Lake County and Davis County, everything in the north, and Utah County in the south. So all the traffic goes through this narrow little spot, these little lanes. And it is in perpetual state of construction. There's always people there. There's always accidents there. And sure enough, in the middle of the winter time, whiteout blizzard, it's 7 o'clock in the morning, totally dark outside, tons of traffic going both ways. And I see a car lose control coming the other way. And this is before they had the concrete barriers between the northbound and southbound traffic on I-15. And there was just the death ditch that we called it, this huge ravine, this huge gully. And a car lost control on the ice, came down, went down to the ditch, jumped up and slammed into me, which spun me into the rest of oncoming traffic, and other cars crashed into me. Oh. So a year later, after, things have healed, but I'm still not healed, I, being this naive, gosh, how old was I? Like 25 years old kid that's still dealing with medical issues. And I saw a billboard on I-15 for 1-800-INJURED. And I could go call some personal injury attorney who could help me get the money that I deserved. And I sat here in this little arbitration hearing. I met with this defense lawyer for 20 minutes before we had an arbitration setting. He explained, he says, okay, we're going to explain why you need medical coverage and why your bill should be covered by this other guy's insurance. And it's going to be totally fine. I think you've totally got it. So I met him for 20 minutes, hardly knew the guy, sat down, and across the table from me, my opponent was the attorney for the insurance company that was supposed to be paying me back. And he walked in and he saw me. And so the other attorney was probably in his mid-50s. He walked in, he looked at me, and he saw me, and he just kind of smiled like, okay, this is going to be a slam dunk. Yes. And we had a 30-minute session before a judge who was an arbiter there. And the other attorney was absolutely relentless. Like I felt like he was mean, and he was rude, and he was speaking very harshly to me. And he was asking me questions about whether I was really hurt and whether I really, and he had me so flustered, I could not answer the questions in a way that I felt was clear and definitive of what my problems were. And it totally caught my attorney off guard. And my attorney basically was like, please give him money because he needs help. So long story short, guess who didn't get any extra money out of that settlement? And guess whose attorney won? It was the other guy. So this kind of made me think about having a defender and why defenders were useful. If you've needed to be a defender, as Laurel says that she's had to be the defender as well, if it works really well, if you have a really good relationship with that defender, then that person really knows you, right? Like in my particular case, my story, the guy didn't know me. He didn't know my story. He didn't know my backstory. And he really had very little of a personal interest of making my defense case happen. Right? There's nothing much in it for him. He was going to get a tiny percentage of a very small medical claim. And I learned later on that he wasn't even their best attorney. Like their ace attorneys that they send for like the really big stuff, they save those for the super important cases. For me, young college kid that had a tiny little insurance policy on his car, you're going to send some assistant to go get that one down. So of course, because that whole thing totally failed, my relationship with them totally soured. I didn't want to do anything else with them. And I felt like they really didn't have my back. So what the heck does this have to do with Doctrine and Covenants 45? Well, in the very beginning, there's this short little verse where God uses language that we also see elsewhere in the Bible about an advocate. And we see that Christ describes himself as the advocate with the Father. So we're starting to introduce this language and this visual representation of this idea of Christ being a defense attorney. Now, aside from the legal system, John, can you explain to us, how would you try to explain what an advocate is?
Yeah, that's great. An advocate is traditionally somebody who takes the position or is in favor of the position of someone that either they represent, that they like, that they basically it's somebody that's got your back, right? It's someone that stands between you traditionally and a power. That could be a legal power, that could be an authoritarian figure, that could be anyone that pleads your case, right, to this power that is in power, right? Someone who pleads for you on your behalf.
Awesome. I like that. Pleading on your behalf. And this goes back for centuries, totally outside of our church system. And I was digging around in a little bit of history Wikipedia last night, as we are wont to do in preparation for these classes. And I went down this rabbit hole of learning about trial by jury. Now, I don't know about you, but when you hear about being a jury member or trial by jury or anything like that, it conjures up all sorts of ideas of sitting around waiting in a courthouse for hours to see if your number is going to get called, and you get the jury summons in the mail, and you're like, we've got to do this thing. You're like, oh my gosh, it's such a pain. I in the first 5 years that we lived here in California, my wife and I had been summoned for jury duty like 3 times. And never once got actually called. We, spent 14 hours sitting in a waiting room with no Wi-Fi and a tiny little power receptacle for your laptop. And it was a struggle. Right. But back in the day, when I say back in the day, I'm talking like 5th or 6th century BC, trial by jury was actually not too different. But let's kind of explore how this came about and why Christ's comments about him being an advocate can make a little bit more sense. All right. So first off, we have to go back in time to a point in time where there were no professional lawyers. Scary, right? There was no professional courts. And in fact, the government system that people lived in was very, very different than we had today. There was no recognition of a mayor of a town and a mayor of a town, and they all report up to the governor or anything like that. There was nothing like that. Initially, it was just tribes. You had tribal people that usually all related to each other, and they would be living all across the land. Eventually, some of those tribes decided to get together, and they'd be living in a big communal area, and they would go and conquer other tribes. And in the early Greek states, we're talking about 6th to 8th century BC, when you had multiple tribes that conquered each other, and they decided to try to live together in some form of a city, there was still no central ruler. There was no one major clan chief, because each tribe was still there, but they're living together in this big city trying to scratch out a living. So there's no central government, just a huge collection of people agreeing to follow some sort of rules. Now, there was a king kind of a person, but it wasn't necessarily a divine right like the Europeans had, and it wasn't necessarily even passed down from father to son, and it wasn't exactly democratically elected. It was just kind of like this figurehead person. Sometimes they ruled by force of law or by force of strength, and they were the one that was kind of in charge of everything else, right? They're the ones that said, okay, you guys, I'm going to have the supreme power, but he couldn't fix all the problems. So what he decided to do, one of the first kings that we saw in these early Greek tribes, a man named Dracon, he wrote down a list of rules, and he says, here's the main rules and here's what the penalties are. And some of these penalties were kind of harsh. That's where the term draconian laws come from. Now, anytime there was a family squabble between tribe members, between different groups of people, like you stole something, like, hey, you've taken my goats, or this person broke in and stole my bag of gold. Or if you had disputes about businesses that you were running, or about your slaves, right? He's taken my slaves and he's working them in his field, and they're supposed to be my slaves. Or you've taken the women of my household, or somebody got in a fight and he beat up my kid, or whatever. If you wanted to be held accountable or hold somebody else accountable, you had to find a way to look for redress, right? You couldn't just go to the king every single day. So they finally said, okay, let's just have everybody else solve it. So they had this idea. They said, if these tribes are going to be living together and everybody's going to be trying to surviving as a society, we have to have each other's backs, as John said earlier, that we will stand up for each other when we need it. And the two main times that they really needed it was, number one, in times of war. So if an enemy comes from the outside, everybody collectively agreed you would drop what you're doing and go get a weapon and go defend the city. So everybody would volunteer to be a soldier. And number two, in times of peace, you would be willing to listen in and help settle disagreements amongst the tribe. In other words, you were willing to be a member of the jury. So they said, okay, here's the deal. We're going to randomly pick people from the city. And if you get called in to be a part of this jury, there's not going to be a judge. There's not going to be attorneys. It's just a huge jury pool of between 200 to upwards of 1,000 people that are going to sit here and listen to both sides of an argument. And then they're going to vote as to who they think is the winner or who is telling the truth. And that'll be the end of it. And we'll pay you like a couple bucks for your trouble. And so that's what they did. So both being a soldier or a member of the jury was unpleasant, but it did establish stability, and it established fairness, and it established predictability if and when you needed help from everybody else. So that's what we would now see in early Greece. We would see no judge. It would be held out in public. You can see kind of here on the screen in the top right, it would usually be held out in this agora, this public arena where people would be out there in the middle of the marketplace. And there was this large platform, or not quite a podium, but this large raised area where somebody else would stand. And this is where they would bring out their arguments, and they would let everybody know what they had problems with. And there was a group of court clerks on the side that would kind of keep track of which trials were being held on which day. They weren't the judges. It was just kind of administrative people to help things keep rolling along. And this means any accuser could come across up to the court, and they would accuse a person, and that person would come defend themselves. So then all the jurors were brought in. And the fascinating thing about this jury is, just like today, it was a cross-section of all slices of life, right? Now, granted, most people were poor farmers. Most people were illiterate. Nobody had any sense of like jury precedent. Nobody had gone to law school. These were not scholars. They were people that had literally just been over there milking a goat, and now you're bringing them in here, and they're going to sit and listen to both sides of the argument. And that's all they have to go off of, is the two sides of the argument. Now, that is key. Because what would happen is when the jury comes in, a very small percentage of the jury would have been wealthy landowners. But the vast majority of folks were very poor, and the jury was so big that whoever was being accused, if they wanted to win their argument one way or the other, the jury was usually too big for them to bribe a majority of them, right? We're talking hundreds and hundreds of people here. So the accusers would be given time to bring charges. Usually an hour or two. They'd have like this little water clock set up on the side, and they say, okay, when that water runs out, it would drip slowly. And when that runs out, your time is done. And then the defendants would stand up and defend themselves. Now, because the laws were very simple, and the decision as to which side of the argument won was private. So you can see here, we've got a little representation of a bronze ballot disc. It's a small little disc that had a marking on it that said this is supposed to be used for a jury, so it couldn't be, melted down and used for money or whatever. Every member of the jury got one of those, and they would listen to two people, and then there was these huge vases set up, huge clay amphora, and a person would walk by, and they would drop their disc into one side or the other, representing the accuser or the defender. And then they would count them out, and the simple majority won. And then everybody agreed that whoever got the majority, that decision was final. So the crowd would vote. It was a simple majority, and kind of like, winning American Idol or whatever. And this also meant that the poor people that were accused for something, they may not have always been able to have a friend stand up for them. And really, that's all they had, because there's no professional lawyers. So this means that if you had a really good accuser, somebody who was really good with words, somebody who was wealthy, somebody who had a really good reputation, and somebody who knew how to draw on the emotions and the appeals of everybody else in the crowd, then that accuser would probably have a good chance of winning. Now, whether or not the accused was actually innocent or guilty is beside the fact, right? Because that accuser, if they could sway the jury to go in their favor, that could work really well. And this brings up the idea of having an advocate for the defender. So as you can see, if you had somebody that was on your back, somebody that had your back that would be willing to stand up for you, that person would only be useful if they themselves also had a sufficiently powerful reputation in order to sway the members of the jury. So if I had been accused and I say, all I can have is I can lay out my side of the case, but let me pull in, I'm going to tag team, bring my buddy in here, and you all know him. That advocate would step up and he could list out his credentials and he could say, here's everything that I believe. And you know how wealthy I am. And I am willing to pay his debt. If that person has a debt, I'm willing to stand up for them. I'm willing to take their place, but I can personally vouch for them. And I'm willing to put my own honor, my own reputation on the line to say that this person is innocent. Or if if a debt was to be paid, I can go ahead and pay it for them. And so let's vote them as innocent and I will pay their debt. And that was the agreement. So having a good advocate like that is a pretty big deal. And it was pretty rare because, having a person that was that well connected was not something that everybody had access to in this city. Okay, so with that very long historical background and that context, let's go back to the Doctrine and Covenants and take a look at this verse. This is in Doctrine and Covenants, section 45, verses 3-5. And I want you to keep that background in mind when you look at the language of who is here. And let's kind of see what sort of sense this means. John, if you're there, would you mind reading those for us? D&C 45, 3-5.
Sure. Listen to him who is the advocate with the Father, who is pleading your cause before him, saying, Father, behold the sufferings and death of him who did no sin, in whom thou wast well pleased. Behold the blood of thy Son, which was shed, the blood of him who thou gavest, that thyself might be glorified. Wherefore, Father, spare these my brethren that believe on my name, that they may come unto me and have everlasting life.
Good stuff. Okay. Now there's a couple pieces to this dramatic scene that is set out that are not specifically called out, but they're certainly implied, right? And it kind of sets the scene right there at the very beginning of verse 3. It says, listen to him who's the advocate with the Father, who's pleading your cause before him. So I don't know about you, but like my mind all of a sudden is like clang, clang. We're in a court system. This is law and order, right? This is us that's being on trial. But there's an implied other party that is here. And that's the accuser, right? The person who's bringing the charges. Right. So who's the accuser in this case? Who's the person that's bringing the charges against us? John, who is it?
Well, in essence, it's the law, right? It is what has to be done, the requirements to actually be and live with our Father again. It's what we all agreed to in the pre-existence. It's what we knew had to happen. And that's who's bringing the charges, really, is the law that stands immutable.
Right. It's that whole idea of, I think it was Spencer Kimball who said, you can't really break the law. You can only break yourself against the law.
Interesting.
You say that law is immutable, and that's part of the agreement. That's the structure that holds our lives together. And if that structure doesn't hold, then society breaks down, right? So that's why we have the law. So in this case, it's us that's doing it. That we've done the things that are wrong, and now we stand accused of these things because of that invisible law force. There's another interesting piece that can kind of go with this that I think kind of also factors in. One of the old definitions of the word Satan is literally accuser. And it's this early Christian notion that Satan was like a prosecuting attorney. This devil was a prosecuting attorney, and God, as being the judge, had to decide whether or not we were worth being saved. And that Lucifer's job, when they labeled him Satan, that's him saying he's the accuser, he would stand there and list all the bad things that we did. He would accuse us of everything that we had done wrong. And so now, to counterpoint that, here we have the advocate on the other side. So now in this particular verse, John, another question for you: is Christ saying that we are innocent in the sense that we've done nothing wrong?
Oh, absolutely not. No. And I think we all realize that, right? That, as we understand, was the plan of Satan, right? That's the one that he proposed, was, I will force you to do right and come back pristine, and therefore you won't need an advocate because you won't be able to transgress the law. The beautiful thing here is Christ is saying, we know that these people misstepped, right? That they had to learn and grow and experience for themselves. Because of the law, which was set up, they are not worthy to return to the presence of the Father. However, there is that clause in the law that says if someone comes and performs what he performed as the Savior for others, then they can indeed return if he will represent them. And again, that beautiful analogy of us, coming underneath his robes, right? Him pulling close us and representing us before the Father and eventually the law.
Yeah. This idea of him prepaying the penalty for us, it's him saying, okay, I've taken care of this. I've already paid for it. And that's the thing that never fails to boggle me when I pause and contemplate just how vast that is. I've heard in the news, and some of the people may have seen in the news, about things like lunchtime school debt, where little kids at elementary schools didn't necessarily, for whatever reason, their family wasn't able to pay for school lunches, and they racked up a debt for school lunches. And there's a couple of instances recently where the policy at the time at the school district was when their school lunch balance hit a certain amount, they were no longer allowed to serve the kid lunch. And I don't know about you, but man, that's pretty harsh, right? And here's this, poor little third grader that's away from their parents. They have no clue about any of this. All they know is that they have a little card, and when they walk into the lunchroom, they swipe it, and it goes, and the lunch lady says, has to take their tray away and say, sorry, you can't have any.
Right.
And I've heard, thankfully, the happy ending to those stories was groups of people or sometimes it was a couple of celebrities that showed up at these schools and said, give me all the lunch debt for the entire school, like all sixth grades or whatever. Let me pay it off because these kids need to eat. They have to live. They have to survive. Let me see how much it is. And it turned out that in some of these cases, the lunch debt was somewhere between like maybe $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. In the grand scheme of things, it was not a ton of money. Now granted, as a poor family, I know that $30,000 of lunch debt spread across a whole lot of people, that does add up.
Absolutely.
But when you consider in the overall school budget, like what the whole school district is trying to get for the whole year, $30K was not a ton. But according to the law that they had set up, it was sufficient to prevent these kids from getting nourished. And so a person stepped in and okay, I'm going to pay this off because these people are more important than, your paltry $30,000. They need to survive. So these celebrities stepped in, or these various people stepped in, and they started paying it off, and they would go from school to school to school to school to pay off the debt. And I couldn't help but wonder, man, when are the funds going to run out? Like, how long can you keep that going? And some folks have chimed in to try to put together an investment pool to try to keep that ball rolling as far as it can. So with that in mind, it certainly kind of helps me understand better about just how big the debt was paid that the Savior did for us, where he went to look to every single one of our school lunches, so to speak. And he says, okay, here is this person. This is the person that had that debt, and that debt has been paid. And so he said to the Father there in verse 5, spare these my brethren that believe on my name, that they may come to me. They've been spared. Their debt is totally paid off. I love that last image you had of the accuser pointing at them and saying, no, that person still owns a debt. And in some cases, these lunch ladies pointed at these little kids, and they're like, no, you have a debt. You can't do this. This is not my law. This is the law. And you are the one that broke it. And there is Christ as the advocate saying, okay, yeah, that person's in debt. However, it's taken care of. So we're going to go ahead and let them through. I saw this wonderful quote that I found just the other night from Elder Dale G. Renlund, and it actually comes from before he was called as an apostle. This is General Conference 2015. I'll go ahead and read this one. This is from a talk that he gave called Latter-day Saints Keep on Trying. He says, quote, God's desire that Latter-day Saints keep on trying also extends beyond overcoming sin. Whether we suffer because of troubled relationships, economic challenges, or illnesses, or as a consequence of somebody else's sins, the Savior's infinite atonement can heal, even and perhaps especially, those who have innocently suffered. So let me pause right there and say, it's one thing for Christ to pay off the debt that because of sin and mistakes that we made, but it's yet another to comprehend his atonement as something that is helping us because of suffering for those who are totally innocent. Kind of like going back to my case at the very beginning where I was in a car crash and I had done nothing wrong. Somebody else crashed in me, but there was still a medical debt that had to be paid, and I couldn't do that. So back to the quote. Elder Renlund says, he understands perfectly what it is like to suffer innocently as a consequence of another's transgression. As prophesied, the Savior will bind up the brokenhearted, give beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. No matter what, with his help, God expects Latter-day Saints to keep on trying. John, any thoughts or comments or things stand out to you from that quote from Elder Renlund or other stuff that we've talked about here so far?
It's interesting because, there's a lot of overtones here in this quote that are analogous to his latest conference talk, right? The infuriating fact that there is injustice in this world. We often don't call things down on us. It's because of others' actions or things that they do. Now, the beautiful thing, like he says here, the Savior's infinite atonement can heal even and perhaps especially those who have innocently suffered. And I think, that's key. That is key and critical to know that those who innocently suffered, that there is justice on the other end, and there is healing on the other end for all of this. And again, as we read in Alma, he went through all this. He had to experience it all so that he could be the perfect advocate and the perfect healer. Bind up the brokenhearted, give beauty for ashes, the joy for mourning, oil of joy for mourning, and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. With his help, God expects us to keep on trying, to keep moving, to do more. I love that.
I also love this comment that Laurel said when we're talking about having Christ in his role. She says, we think that Christ is only our defender when we do something wrong, but he has taken every burden that we will experience. This means that if or when something happens to you, Jesus has taken whatever would be too much from you. I was in a really bad car accident, so I know the relieving aspect of his atonement. I think that's a really good point. And I know that, I'm not the only one that has had that happen or knows what that feels like. But having a person that could actually be in there to help, to have gone through that pain, to have experienced that force, and to know exactly what that's like, man, that is such a relief to know that you've got that person on the other side. That person can give you that relief and that succor that you need. Okay. We'd like to switch gears just a little bit with that. So the one major theme that we see here is everything about Christ as a defender. The interesting part about this section is he now kind of changes topics a little bit. He being the author, or in this case, the revelator, the Savior, as he's speaking to Joseph Smith. And the whole rest of the section all of a sudden talks about this prophecy of the latter days and this second coming. So we're not going to read the entire thing. People can go ahead and do that on their own. But a couple things that I wanted to bring out here. First off, a question for John or anybody else that's there. Raise your hand if you have been taught or you thought that the second coming was going to happen in your lifetime. John, how about you? Did you ever hear that shared in a class or anywhere else that was going to be happening soon?
Yes, for sure. And we even realized, right, back in the 1830s, 40s, in the early church history, they thought it was imminent too. And, I had my eyes opened. I remember Elder Packer once, I don't think he was President Packer at the time, but he said, go ahead and plant a tree in your front yard or something to that effect, and your grandchildren will be able to swing from that tree. So, yeah. So again, I think sometimes I think I don't want to call it a scare tactic, but it's almost this, you have to be ready at any time because, we are the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Christ's coming is imminent, and we have to be ready for that. Therefore, preppers, therefore, all of this other stuff. And I think it's more a state of mind than it is anything else.
This is a really interesting thing, because this is, I think, I would say this is one of the hallmarks of Christianity, this belief in millennialism, this belief in the God that we worship gonna come back. So get ready, but nobody knows when it's going to happen. Yes. And for 2,000 years now, we've been trying to figure out just what that means and how do we deal with it. Now, as Latter-day Saints, it's like we have yet an extra layer kind of built on top of all of that, because we have prophets. And sometimes in our church, I mean, let's be honest, sometimes our people have been looking at the prophets to give us hints of when it's going to happen. Even though the scriptures themselves, and even though the prophets themselves have said, we don't know. And if we did, we wouldn't tell you, but we're not going to say anything. So stop trying to connect the dots and think that it's going to be happening soon.
Right.
And this is, I think, a useful part of what I hope is going to be useful for our discussion today. I don't know if you've ever felt this way, John, or if any of our other listeners have felt this way, but sometimes it kind of feels like this unaddressed elephant in the room is, what are we doing about how we talk about the second coming? And here's what I mean. Several years ago, I was sitting in a stake leadership meeting with a particular group of brethren who were really thinking that the second coming was going to be happening. But they didn't want to say that it was going to be happening, but they felt like they really needed to prepare people for it. And this came across in their language in these council meetings about what to do for the ward and how they could help them spiritually. And a lot of that language was focused on emergency preparedness. It was focused on stake communication and evacuation drills, where they tried to mobilize the entire stake all at once. A lot of things were focused on getting people ready for judgment. A lot of things were focused on getting people ready for an event. And while I'm sure that they did their best to persuade people that this was not going to be happening anytime soon, at the same time, people will hear what they want to hear. And for those that had, I don't want to call it paranoia, but for those that were looking forward with extreme interest to the second coming happening in their life, when they heard this language coming out of stake leadership, and when some of the leaders themselves were pointing towards that, there was a level of anxiety that started to notch up, thinking that that maybe stake leaders knew something, or they were trying to convince people that something was about to happen. Now, in the middle of this, we saw astrologers telling us very predictably that there was going to be a blood moon eclipse in 2019. Do you remember this, John? You guys remember when that happened, right?
Yes.
And we started to see all across Christianity a large section of people that thought that that was it, that the blood moon of 2019, the blood moon eclipse in the fall of 2019 was going to be the final sign. And part of the challenge is that we look in the scriptures, and the scriptures would say things like, if you're looking for the signs, you'll recognize them. You know, like if you have enough faith, or if your testimony is mature enough, you'll recognize these signs. So this isn't going to surprise people. And so we kind of start looking for the things to validate our faith. And we saw this blood moon eclipse. And I remember opening up the newspaper one day and seeing sale after sale after sale after sale for emergency preparedness stores all across Utah. And then I went to their websites and they said sold, out of stock, out of stock, out of stock, out of stock. And there was like this massive run because we thought that something was going to happen. So my wife and I were talking about, okay, so what's going to happen? Like hypothetically, what if that was it? Like what if that was the big thing? And the night of the eclipse, we decided to go out and watch it. So there's this park by our house with these levee trails that give you this little tiny hill that you can stand up and look on this hill and kind of look out across the valley. So sure enough, the night of the eclipse, we went out there with our boys in some chairs, and we didn't tell them anything about all the fear and some of the panic. And we'd seen the YouTube videos and the preppers that were out there and the people that were worried about something happening. And we sat up there and we waited for this eclipse to rise. And I'm not going to lie, I pulled out my phone and I was flipping through the news of seeing what was going on around the world, because there was a lot of anxiety and people going, okay, is this going to be the thing? And I whipped out my phone. I was like, wait a minute, I'm here in California. This blood moon eclipse thing has already taken place several time zones ahead of us. So let me just casually scroll through CNN and see if there's no people rising from the dead. Nope, there's no plagues that have been released. Okay, so we're perfectly fine. And as that moon came up over the mountains, and for a split second, my heart started to beat like, oh my gosh, something's going to happen. And then the moon rose and the eclipse happened. And then it stopped and life went on. And I kind of went, huh. And you had this little bit sense of, okay, there's a little bit of disappointment. Not that I wanted all the atrocities to happen, but it's the sense of, okay, so when? Like, what do we do? I've had grandparents that have lived and died that have thought that it was going to happen in their lifetime. You know, as we see, Lori Whitehead says, you know, President Benson told BYU students in the early 80s that they would be alive during the second coming. And then that doesn't happen. You know, Laurel says, I believe that every one of Christ's disciples will be present for the second coming. So every time everyone was told that, it is true. And so part of the challenge that we have with our faith is reconciling those statements. You know, the skeptic might look at this from the outside and say, okay, well, when it doesn't happen, then you just have to move the goalposts, right? You change the definition of, well, when President Benson said people would be alive, he didn't mean alive, he meant resurrected. So technically that's going to be for everybody. So I think one of the useful questions that we have as we struggle with this part of our faith is trying to understand what is a useful way to talk about the second coming that does not, well, I'm going to make a big assumption here. I'm going to make the assumption that it is not helpful to be living in a constant state of dread. I don't think it's a helpful thing for us to be living in this perpetual state of paranoia. That is not a sustainable thing that can be beneficial to the world around us. So if that is an assumption, and if anybody out there disagrees with it, please let us know. And John, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it as well. If living in a perpetual state of dread is not the best way to do it, then how should we be living instead? What does it mean to be looking forward to an event that hasn't happened yet, where we kind of balance between optimistic faith versus cynical dismissal that it's not ever going to happen at all? How are we supposed to talk about the second coming and live with it? What do you think, John?
Yeah, great question. You know, a couple thoughts. Number one, you're right? We should not be living in this perpetual state of dread or foreboding or, you know, even constant concern about that. If that is the thing that is, you know, taking up our brain cycles, gosh, we've got a lot to learn, right? We learn in 4th Nephi, they lived after the man of happiness, and that's how we should live, right? The gospel should bring that happiness, that hope to our lives. And if we consider the second coming too, I mean, there is an actual second coming that we're expecting, right? When Christ comes back in red, right? And he'll come back in glory. And we know that during that time, that will be, some people will be around and some will not. There will be cataclysms that predate that. And that's what we often hear alluded to when we hear of earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars, et cetera, et cetera. But again, one way to look at this, and I know this might be a little trite and a trope, but our second coming comes when we pass, right? I mean, to some extent, We have to, that talks about a reckoning. And really that's what this is. And if we're only concerned about what happens with us physically, and often we discuss that because of all the things that will take place, gosh, that's a little short-sighted, because we know that this life is just, a millisecond in the things that are happening and will happen to us. So I think it's interesting. It's definitely something to concern ourselves with. But again, I think it's more a situation of when that second coming comes for us, which can happen, I believe, similar to when we pass.
Absolutely. I think there is room in Christianity as a whole, but Mormonism in general, or in specific, that can allow for a meaningful way to engage in the world around us that simultaneously looks forward towards the advent of Christ, but also tries to find meaning in the day-to-day of extending this life as long as we can, as if that second coming were not going to happen. And here's what I mean. I have spoken with members of the church that have told me that they don't believe in spending money to try to clean up the environment, because when Christ comes again, the whole world is just going to be renewed. So why bother? Kind of like saying, yeah, we trashed the house because we had a party this weekend, but mom and dad are going to nuke the place when they get back anyway. So why bother cleaning up after the party?
Right.
And I remember looking at them and thinking, if you're wrong about this, that means that your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids are going to be living in an absolute dystopian hellscape full of horrible things because you were placing your bet on the Christ coming and him cleaning up your mess.
And that's why we watch Mad Max Thunderdome, right?
And then we've got Thunderdome, right? Next thing you know, you've got people that are spraying their mouth with chrome paint and they're looking for water and all that kind of stuff. And not only that, but doesn't that also kind of go against this whole original admonition clear back in the original garden where God said to Adam and Eve, take care of this garden and dress it, as in y'all are responsible for this place. I'm handing you the keys, but just because I'm coming back to check up on it later doesn't mean you get to totally trash it.
Absolutely.
I've had this discussion with my own kids about why we need to take care of these things as if it wasn't going to happen. And they've asked this exact same question, like, well, wait a minute, if he's going to be coming again, does this mean we don't have to pay attention to, we don't have to try to fix equality or justice or, social issues because he's going to be coming back and he's going to take it. Why can't he just take care of it for us? Why can't we offload our responsibility? And I think therein lies the frailty of doomsday obsession, where we try to excuse ourselves from the problem of the world around us, sometimes thinking that they're just too big for us to handle, or they're too complex, or it's going to require too much of a seismic shift in our behavior. And it would be just so much easier if Christ would just come down and snap his fingers and take care of things, and bam, everything's better. Because I think deep down inside, we know that the reality is that he's expecting us to clean up our own mess. And there are verses in the Doctrine and Covenants that say, yeah, things are going to get bad before he comes again. Let's take a look at D&C 45, verses 30 through 33. I'll go ahead and read this, John, if you want to pull that slide up for us. D&C 45, 30 through 33. Here we go. It says, in that generation, speaking of the last days, shall the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And there shall be men and women standing in that generation that shall not pass until they shall see an overflowing scourge, for a desolating sickness shall cover the land. Wow, where have we seen that before?
Right.
But my disciples shall stand in holy places and shall not be moved. But among the wicked, men shall lift up their voices and curse God and die. There shall be earthquakes also in diverse places and many desolations, yet men will harden their hearts against me, and they will take up the sword or the gun, one against another, and they will kill one another. I mean, this is kind of scary language, and these are things that have been prophesied, and this is nothing new. We've seen that happen before. And I think when we see verses like that, a lot of times we have this tendency to look for confirmationism, like confirmation bias, where we say, ha, right, that proves it. That's talking about our day. That's going to happen. So if coronavirus was prophesied in D&C 45:31, it's right there. He who has eyes to see, let him see. But on top of that, it still gives the question to us, so therefore what? Like, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to deal with this? Does this mean that we just sit back and let it happen and we wait for the 10 to 20 to 80 years to the hundreds of years? And this can bring up an interesting thought experiment, some that I think could change behavior for some of us. What if we knew that the second coming was going to happen 200 years from now? Like, if we knew, would we do anything different if we knew that we had a countdown timer? Would we bother trying to make the world a better place? Would we bother getting education? Would we bother trying to make the world more fair, more just? Would we bother trying to succor the person on the side of the road to Jericho if we knew that the road to Jericho was going to get nuked in 200 years? Would our behavior shift at all if we had that timeline? And, the more I think about it, the more it feels like if we knew that finish line was coming, some people would even use it as a further justification of saying, ha, see, told you the end is coming. I don't have to clean up anyway. And maybe that is the paradox that we have to struggle with as believers, which is perhaps the most fruitful, beneficial, and sustainable way to live would be as if the second coming wasn't going to be happening anytime soon at all, but fully knowing well that it actually would, and we would be held accountable for how we use our time in the meantime. Maybe what if immortality and heaven and Zion didn't come down here until it was us that created it? What if this whole idea of people living with glorified bodies, where the wealthy and the poor live together, where all humanity is equal, what if it all came because humanity finally said, oh my gosh, we're in this for ourselves. Nobody's going to clean up after us. Nobody's going to come here to fix our problems for us. What if we looked around and we realized we are all that we have? We are on this life raft together. Guys, if we don't turn this earth into heaven, nobody will. And when we finally put aside the differences and we beat the swords into plowshares and we finally try to make this earth heaven, could that be the point where God finally says, now you're getting it? Now you realize that the point was not for God to come down and fix all of our problems, but for all of y'all to fix your problems yourselves. And that's what heaven is when you realize that you have to take care of each other more than just yourself. And when you have people collectively trying to take care of each other to the best of their abilities, maybe that's what Zion is. I found this wonderful quote from Gordon B. Hinckley from a devotional that he gave. This was years ago. This was at Weber State. This is clear back in the before times, 1997. And here he is addressing an unspoken question that I know that I have had and other people have had so many times, which is, why should I bother going to school or going to college or whatever if the second coming is going to happen? And I remember thinking this as a teenager, like legit, growing up in Utah County, I remember thinking, why should I even bother if sometime in the year 2000, God's going to come down and, twinkle us all up to heaven and everything. And here is what he said to these students. This was at a devotional at Institute in Weber State University, April 15, 1997. An excerpt that he says, quote, how do we prepare for the second coming? Well, you just do not worry about it. You just live the kind of life that if the second coming were to be tomorrow, you would be ready. Nobody knows when it's going to happen. No one knows when the Savior is coming, not even the angels in heaven. Our responsibility is to prepare ourselves to live worthy of the association of the Savior, to deport ourselves in such a way that we would not be embarrassed if he were to come among us. John, your thoughts? What is he saying here?
Yeah, love this. And Laurel earlier said, live ready. You'll never be uncomfortable with this. Again, I think we get so preoccupied with a date, a time, a timeline, so that we can excuse ourselves, as you've alluded to previously, of how we are or are not working toward that, right? And our responsibility. I've often thought, why am I saving and putting money into a 401k, right? If we know that
money's not going to matter.
Exactly. Money is not a thing. So, but again, I think it's more toward the character building, toward, looking to become more Christ-like and trying to do the things that he would do, and really preparing ourselves individually. And I think it's more spiritually than physically, because our time will come. And when it does come, we just have to be prepared.
Absolutely. Some final thoughts as we wrap up here at the end. And thank you so much, John, for all of your commentary and your participation here, as well as everybody else that's been here in the class. We hope that this has been helpful and engaging and thoughtful. And as you go and as you study the rest of Come Follow Me this week, or as thoughts come to you this week, we hope that this would give you a new perspective and a better way to engage in the world around us. Our Christian discipleship is a very unique religion, like we've talked about. The core premise is this idea that the boss has gone away, but they left us with instructions. And we've been left to our own devices, knowing full well that that boss is going to come back. We don't know when. So we can procrastinate, we can wait it out, or we could say, what if they don't ever come back at all? And then we could do whatever little we can right now and try to make this world the best version that we possibly could for whenever they get back. Sometimes people try to lead this way, that sort of life, with a fear of punishment, where they say, that you have to be good because at the second coming, if you're not good, you're going to get punished. Or some people do it out of a sense of duty, like that's what I'm supposed to do. Or they do it out of a sense of reward, like I'm going to be a good person because I'm hoping to get a personal reward after all of this. And perhaps each of those different modalities does have a purpose. Maybe they do have their usefulness. But I wonder how different our lives would be if we were to live not out of fear of punishment, but not out of hope of reward, but because we are willing to listen to the voice inside our soul that says being a good person to the person around us and taking care of the world around us is the right thing to do, because we are people worth being good for. My kids would often ask us when they were little, they say, why do I have to clean the bathroom on Saturday? It's not like we have people coming over. Why do I have to mop the kitchen? And if anybody who has ever had guests, or back in the day when the home teachers were going to show up or somebody's going to drop by, there's that last minute cleaning frenzy, like, hurry, let's make this house look spick and span as if nobody actually lived here, right? Let's erase all the traces of humanity from this place that everybody knows is full of humans. And we do it. We go to some other place, some other person's home, and they've done the same thing. They got it cleaned up before we showed up. And my wise wife would look at the boys and say, you're right. This Saturday, we don't have guests coming over, but we're going to mop this kitchen because we live here, and that should be good enough. So here's a mop. I love you. Go do your thing. So maybe whether it's, making long-term plans for our life, whether it's education or jobs, or maybe it's trying to be stewards of the planet or the environment like we've talked about, or bringing peace and justice to the poor, or trying to help the refugee or the marginalized, or all these people around us, these least of these that we've been asked as Christian disciples to reach out for. Maybe heaven will finally arrive, and that second coming will finally arrive when we build it and make it a welcoming enough place. So that will do it for us today. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that this has been a good, beneficial use of your time, and that it's been an uplifting message for you. Please be sure to tune in later this week for the regular discussion for all things about news with Jenny and Brent. And for next week, we'll be right here just a little bit after 9 o'clock, 9-ish, 8, 9-ish Mountain Time, for yet another edition of our Mormon News Report Sunday School. Until then, have a great day, keep being awesome, and go light the dark. Cheers, everybody.